Relax, son, close one eye, and keep your gaze fixed on your goal. From behind me, my father spoke calmly. I tried to relax my muscles, one eye closed, to eliminate the double vision caused by having the rifle sight so close to my gaze. "That's great," he said. "When you're ready, take a deep breath, don't hold it for too long or you'll start shaking, and slowly squeeze the trigger down like you're milking a cow." I had to laugh at that, Dad, because I had never milked a cow before. As I spoke, he furrowed his brow and adjusted his baseball cap on his head. "That's how my father described it to me, you understand." I shook my head and smiled a little. It wasn't the first, second, or even third time my father had told me how to shoot. He had a habit of repeating himself. But I don't mind. I returned my attention to the target through the sight and concentrated. "I still took everything," he said relaxedly, allowing muscles to relax just enough. I closed one eye, my gaze fixed on the bull's eyes at the end of the barrel. My breath caught in my throat, and I squeezed the trigger slowly. The rifle jumped in my hands, jerking heavily as it bounced back, and my head jerked backwards, uneasy of the weapon as it jumped up. I was still a little nervous because the scope smacked me in the eye, bruising and cutting my brow the last time I went to the range. I couldn't see from where we were at the shooting range station, but I was confident in my shot. My father leaned into the spotting scope we had set up, a small nod and a smile curled up on his lips. "Not too shabby. Examine it out." I stood up and shifted my gaze to the scope. It took a few moments for me to focus through it before I could see the small black hole in the target at the far end of the range. Being a little high into the left of the center wasn't a bullseye. My father nodded, his hand on my shoulder. If it had been a deer, it would have been a direct hit. I returned his smile and asked, "Do you think I have a chance at hitting something this weekend?" He let out a breath and shrugged his shoulders. "It's conceivable," he said. "Well, try it now and see if you can actually hit the bull's eye." I chuckled, shook my head, and returned to the station. I went, raised the rifle, and refocused. With any luck, we'll be able to bring back something from this hunting trip. That would be a departure. I haven't shot since the rifle range day. But I wasn't too concerned. Apparently, I was a pretty good shooter. However, there are no bull's eyes. But, hey, it's close enough. And I was getting used to the 30 or so short mag Browning rifles my father had purchased for us to use. With the padded stocks and a firm grip, they packed a mean kick butt. You should be able to keep them under control. My father had been planning this trip for quite some time and had purchased the 2 Brownings specifically for it. The plan was that my dad, Uncle John, and John would head up to this out in the middle of nowhere place where my dad used to deer hunt with his father and do the same for the weekend, to be honest. I was never a big fan of being outside. It meant being too hot during the day and too cold at night, being bitten by bugs everywhere, and constantly feeling the need for a shower. But I did it for my father. Recently, my father Fred wasn't doing so well. He had cancer as well as severe vasculitis. A couple of years ago, it really knocked him down a notch. I recall a fearless and strong man who could make anyone back down with a hard stare. He was drastically different now. He was a former shadow of himself, much skinnier, and he had the look of a man who had faced real death. It shook him to his core and made me realize that I might not have as much time with this man as I thought. That's probably what my uncle was thinking. John wasn't my father's brother, but rather my mother's. He was a bit more of a city boy like me. He has recently taken up a number of random hobbies while teaching at one of the local high schools. Even as we drove up, I noticed that they were carrying a fancy new Nikon DSLR camera around his neck on a strap. We brought 2 Brownings and my father's old 30-30 rifle with us. But we didn't expect John to shoot anything unless he had his camera with him. I figured the only reason my father brought his 30-30 was for nostalgia rather than for all of us to shoot. He kept the gun he used with his father as if it were brand new. Even with proper care and maintenance, it was still quite old, and the new Brownings were far more sturdy. He even got them brand new scopes and shoulder straps, the whole shebang. If a deer crossed our path, we'd be prepared to take it down there. In the afternoon, we arrived at our hunting location. It was a few hours from where we lived, followed by another hour of driving on a dirt and gravel road, which was the most boring part of the trip. With all of the bumps and dips in the road, the car couldn't go faster than 15 miles per hour. Finally, we arrived at our destination, which turned out to be a small clearing in the middle of a dense forest. I don't recall the exact location, only that it was quite a distance away. We set up camp, just a large single tent for the 3 of us, and unpacked some of our gear, including some of John's nice camping cook gear. And my father had already cooked some ribs and chicken that we only needed to heat up. So Fred John began as we munched on some ribs, which was the first thing we did after setting up. What are the chances of catching a deer out here? Is yours as good as anyone else's? My father shrugged. There is a brief pause before John speaks again. Let's say we get a deer, what do we do then? Brow furrowed as he focuses on my father. It appeared to be a harmless question, but I knew where it was leading. If we got a deer, how did we plan on taking care of the heavy thing in the middle of the brush? Or more specifically, how did my father plan on taking care of it? John's a good guy, but he might have been overly concerned for my father. My father lost a lot of strength in the hospital, but he wasn't weak yet, and he despised it when people assumed he was. We'll carry it up and back here. He spoke quickly, a hint of annoyance in his tone. David will handle it properly, son. With a slight smile, he inquired. I replaced it with one of my own and nodded, yeah, I can handle it. I'm stronger than I appear. My father's grin widened. John simply shrugged his shoulders. We finished shortly after, and the sun began to show the first signs of setting toward the horizon. We'll still have a couple of hours before it gets dark. As he looked up at the sky, Dad said, "You want to go for a walk and see if we get lucky?" "Sure," I said. "So why not?" John agreed, and the 3 of us were soon trudging off into the woods. Only day to night carried our weapons, both of which were brand new Brownings. John was content with just having his camera with him. Dad led the way through the narrow path, seemingly recalling memories of himself and his father. I trudged alongside him. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, and John was in the back, his hands lingering near his camera. I'd occasionally hear a soft click as he took a picture of some interesting scenery as we walked by. We didn't find much, no deer, and if we didn't see any animals other than random birds and hordes of bugs, I was getting tired and my legs were hurting. It had been a long day, and all I wanted to do was sit down and unwind before cocking out. As the sun set lower, the chill began to creep in, nipping at me even through my jacket. Dad pushed on before coming to a halt and bending down. "Look for something?" I inquired as John and I both stood up and gazed down at the ground. My father noticed something in the soft dirt, a set of cloven tracks pressed into the dirt running along the path, rabbit deer tracks. He smiled slightly and rose slowly, following them down the path. They proceed here, and then he tailed off, raising his brow and crouched back down to the ground. As John and I approached Dad, I inquired, pointed to the ground once more. We were able to see what he was looking at. The prince abruptly shifted and appeared to move off the path toward the forest, but this was not unusual. There were 2 more footprints in the dirt near the deers that pointed in the right direction. Is that a bear, John, in which the deer fled? While focusing on those 2 prints in the earth, I asked my father. I thought they were from the bear, but they looked strange. My father noticed it. Bear prints have a distinct shape where the paw lands in the dirt with 5 toes, and depending on how the bear was moving, you might miss the little one. The claw marks above the 3 toes dug deep into the ground in these prints, which had only 3 toes and an elongated print where the base of the path fell. It almost seemed like he'd make his footprint if you gave him 3 toes instead of 5, and some thick, deadly claws, and the size of them didn't make me feel at all comfortable looking at them, not the right shape. Dad finally spoke up as he stood, and it wasn't a mountain lion. Bigfoot. With a nervous chuckle, I inquired. I attempted to lighten the gloomy mood. They say he could be out here, Dad remarked with a grin, and I could tell. He was only joking with me to lighten the mood. We could all feel it, an uneasiness that was beginning to set in. A chill had run through me as I stared at those prints, and it wasn't from the cold. Maybe we should call it a day, but before it gets dark, suggested John. Nobody objected. We turned around and started walking back down the path. I kept a hand on the rifle's shoulder strap, ready to remove it if necessary. My father was doing the same thing, which I noticed. When we got back, we didn't say much. John started a fire before it got too dark, and the 3 of us sat around it for a while as the night fell. It actually seemed rather peaceful. I could hear the light chirps of crickets in the woods and even the flutter of some of the nighttime birds flying by as light chat resumed, and we forgot about those strange prints. John and my father talked about random things like TV shows they were watching or memories my father had of the area. Even though I was a city boy, it was nice to spend time with my family, and I could tell my father was having a good time. He simply seemed fuller, more alive. Perhaps his memories of happier times were assisting him in his recovery. I hope this encourages them to assist them further. I'm hoping that making more memories will help them. We went to bed not long after John put out the fire, and the darkness descended on the camp, with only the stars and moon providing enough light for us to get comfortable in the tent. As I drifted off to sleep in my sleeping bag, I noticed something, perhaps because I was too tired to care or because my mind forced me to ignore it. However, it appears strange when the sounds of the forest seem to stop completely. The cricket's song ended, and the shifting of hidden nocturnal animals came to an end. As sleep claimed me, I could feel a familiar uneasiness building up in my stomach, the same feeling I had when we all stared at the strangely shaped tracks with claws that seemed to sink deep into the earth below. I awoke from a dreamless sleep to a scent that flew in and hit me square in the gut. Bacon? Bacon? I got out of my sleeping bag, changed my clothes, and walked outside the tent. John stood in front of the camping fire. When my father double-checked the guns, making sure they were ready for today's journey, he started frying up a fresh batch of bacon. Morning. David John grinned as he held up the pan. We're almost done. I also got some eggs. In the woods, bacon and eggs. I wasn't unhappy. We ate breakfast, happily joking around a bit and fantasizing about all the different ways we're going to cook the deer and how we were sure to get it on this trip. Last night's strangeness was completely forgotten at this point. After breakfast we cleaned up and Dad handed me one of the brownings. Are you prepared, son? He asked with a slight smile, and I nodded before taking the rifle and slinging it over my shoulder. Yeah, it'll be good to get an early start this time as well. Both father and son had prepared their weapons as John double-checked his camera's settings for the day. He even took a picture of the two of us smiling at the camera. It felt great. It had been a long time since my father and I had had the opportunity to do something truly together. I still remember walking into his room and seeing him hooked up to all those machines with this look that screamed help me, but I couldn't do anything. And before that, we'd been through a rough patch, just stupid years of me being a dumb adolescent leading up to being a dumb young adult, and now I felt closer to him than ever. I had the impression that we were re-establishing the family, and I will never forget that feeling. Then we took off into the woods, Dad in front and John in back, moving along the path with our eyes peeled for anything moving in the woods and our ears listening for just the slightest sound overall. It was a peaceful morning that turned into a peaceful afternoon. We walked and moved, climbing over fallen trees that had blocked the path or slipping through overgrown areas where the plants were working to reclaim areas that man and animal, but mostly animal, had trudged through. I admit that I was becoming bored and tired. You can only walk for so long without seeing anything before you get bored. Dad, on the other hand, showed no signs of exhaustion, even after being released from the hospital so quickly. He moved with purpose. I expected to come across a tree that was a little too large or an overgrown patch that was a little too thick, but he moved on without saying anything or complaining. It was all worth it in the end. We came to a halt as my father extended his hand, both John and I striking awkward poses before putting our feet down in the distance. It took me a few moments to figure out what he was looking at. It was difficult to see the light brown form of a deer through the brush and trees. It was grazing on something on the ground in the distance, through the trees. Then, as luck would have it, it was a buck, and two sets of large antlers rose from its head tall and proud before breaking off into two branches apiece, a forked horn, as my father would call it. It didn't appear to see, smell, or even sense us yet. My father smiled at me and motioned with his hand to the rifle on my shoulder. "Do you want to go for it, son?" He spoke softly to me. My hand was still on the rifle when I slipped it off. The gun felt heavy in my hands, but it became significantly heavier at the range. The shot seemed so far away, and the brush was all over the place. "No," I said, shaking my head, my face flushed with embarrassment. "Dad, do you do it? I'm not sure I could hit it that far away." He hesitated, but nodded as he returned to slinging and raising his own rifle. I was hoping he wouldn't be upset that I couldn't take the shot. I just didn't want to miss this opportunity. We finally come across the deer, and I blow it by missing my shot. I knew Dad was going to get it. I could almost hear him silently cursing himself as he looked around. He was looking for a place to balance his rifle because there wasn't anywhere convenient right now. "You should always keep your rifle steady." He instilled in me that standing up with no rest was the worst way to shoot. You only need to do it if you have to, and if you have to remember everything else, you'll need every advantage you can get to hit something without rest. My father eventually moved, to sit on his back in the dirt, his knees rising up. That way wasn't as good as finding a rest for your gun, but you can use your knees to study both your back elbow and your front as you aimed, and the deer's head rose and began to look around. With it, our welcome was fading. Dad approached the sight, and I heard him take a short breath, not daring to let it out before his finger slowly fell upon the trigger. I saw the bug jerk and stumble in the distance as the shot rang out. It staggered for a moment before sprinting away from us through the trees. My father stood up and lifted his head, watching it as John and I finally made our moves and approached him. John asked, looking off in the distance, "You get it, Fred?" "I don't believe you got it." "I got it," Dad said with a confident grin. "I got him." He looked at me, and I smiled back. I couldn't tell if the deer had been hit or not. I'd rather believe my father got him, than that he didn't. "Should we pursue it?" I spoke as I gazed off to where the deer had been. "Yeah," Dad responded as he began to push on the rifle slung over his shoulder, saying it couldn't have gone very far. So the three of us searched through the brush for the injured deer. We came across the spot where it had lingered. A fresh patch of blood had covered a nearby tree, and splashed the dirt on the ground as a result. My father simply smiled in the center. "I warned you." So, look over to my uncle before he took a few steps, and sure enough, another splash of blood had stained the earth below in the direction the deer ran off in. My father declared triumphantly, pumping his fist. "Let's get him back now. He's not going to get too far away from it." The blood trail continued for quite some distance, and there were times when I completely lost track of it. I couldn't tell if we had taken the wrong turn or if the deer had stopped bleeding. My father persisted, and every now and then, we'd discover a new splash of brownish red mixed in with the dirt. The path led directly to a large overgrown patch of brush that appeared trampled and squished, as if something heavy had fallen upon it. A large pool of blood splattered across those plants and sunk into the earth beneath them. The clear idea seemed to be that the deer had staggered here and then collapsed onto this brush. There were no deer, only blood and ripped up plants to indicate that something heavy and bleeding had fallen here. My father adjusted the ball cap on his head once more and moved up to investigate. "That's strange." As he ran his hand along the plant's bloody leaves, he remarked, "Looks like he should be right here." I don't think he could have gotten up, and after falling with such a blow, John and I both stepped forward to take a look. It didn't appear that anything had fallen here. The deer had to have done it. What else had recently been injured and bleeding? Something odd was noticed by John first. He had moved around the back of the brush and discovered an area behind it that had been trampled to the ground, blood streaked along the leaves and the ground below, moving off into the woods as if something was being dragged. John motioned my father over, who gave me a thoughtful look. "Do you think something got away with it?" Maybe John questioned my father, but not so quickly. "It just doesn't seem possible," Dad said, shaking his head. I took a step back, intrigued, and nervous. The memory of a specific set of footprints resurfaced in my mind. After a moment, John suggested, "Let's take a look." It shouldn't be too far, but curiosity got the best of us, and we started walking in the direction of the blood streaks. Instead of the more circular splatters we'd seen on the way here, each bit of the blood trail rolled along the earth in a curving line before stopping only to resume a few feet further on. I didn't notice when the chirping of birds and animals stopped, or when the buzzing of insects stopped. I didn't notice the faint tearing of something squishy. My father must have heard it as well, because he slipped the rifle off his shoulder as we all huddled down, and moved as quietly as we could. I was the first to notice it. Thank God for the brush, otherwise, I might have seen all of it head-on in the daylight in the distance, through the trees, appearing to be a creature crouched over something. It was difficult to see through the brush in the distance, but I could clearly see brown, black fur or skin on a muzzle. We three came to a halt and watched it in silence. As I looked closer, I noticed that the fur was always in patches on it, and there appeared to be blood starting to coat areas of it. It leaned over and bit into something on the ground, which turned out to be a deer. I could see a few forked antlers sticking up. I also saw what appeared to be a hand raise up, large sights of claws gleaming on a three-fingered hand before lowering to dig deeper and tear more into the meat. I started feeling sick, as if I was going to puke. Earlier, this thing made those tracks. I had a feeling. Dad was looking away, stunned, while John seemed to finger his camera, debating whether or not to take a photograph. When the creature snapped its head up, I got my first glimpse of its gleaming, bloodshot red eyes. It locked its gaze on us. It then let out a high-pitched, grating screech, as if the vibration of the sound was tearing apart part of its inner throat. My father rose to his feet and angled the gun as it launched itself in our direction, still screeching that dreadful sound. I was standing there as he yelled something to John and me, and I assumed it was run because John turned and ran. I stood my ground as my father fired a shot through the trees that I knew would miss, and with a moving target, he'd be lucky to hit it with the rest. But, with no other option, the shot caused the thing to veer off and into the trees on our right side. That's when my father turned and started running himself. I bolted after him, my heart pounding in my throat as I ran. I could hear the trees crashing on our right side and then on our left. How could it switch so quickly? That screech admitted itself once more, and I felt like the terrified deer running through the woods as death loomed over me. I'm not sure how long Dad and I ran for, but it was long enough that my legs began to cramp and my breath began to wheeze. He stumbled and gasped for air in ragged gasps. His recent problems must have finally caught up with him. He pushed on, and I did the same. I never left his side, even though he slowed like hell, because I was going to leave him while that thing chased us. I could tell he wanted me to push forward, leaving him behind and escaping on my own. My mind wandered to a joke my father used to tell us about campers who bring running shoes. The other inquired as to why he had brought running shoes and if he expected to outrun a bear with his money. No, all I have to do is outrun you. This was not a joke. I'm not sure how we did it, but the two of us soon burst into our campsite, gasping and wheezing for air. Dad coughed and walked over to the car, leaning against it with his arm, coughed, and sat up. I looked up as I bent over and gasped, to see him still coughing and lurching, and my stomach twisted. He wasn't progressing slowly. I approached him and placed my hand on his shoulder. I asked quietly, "Dad, are you okay?" "Yeah. I'm fine," he said in a ragged voice between coughs. "Are you all right?" Still worried about me when he looked like he was about to cough up a lung. "Everything is fine with me." I reassured him before leaving my head, but as I looked around our solitary campsite, I realized something was missing. John was nowhere to be found. I took a step away from my father, my gaze wandering around the camp. It appeared untouched, just as we had left it this morning, but John was not present. I returned my gaze to my father, who appeared to have recovered and pushed himself away from the car. I informed him that John was not present. My father cursed as I looked around, and his gaze returned to the woods, where that same creature had been. My gaze followed him, and I swallowed some of the re-emerging bacon and eggs. "Do you believe he's still alive? Do you think that thing will track him down?" My father cut me off as he took a deep breath, saying, "Get some fresh water and food ready for us. Have you checked your ammo?" He gave the order. I didn't confront him. I refilled our water canteens and stuffed some of the quick snack foods we brought with us into small bags. I double-checked my ammunition and discovered that my clip was still full. I hadn't even fired a single round. Dad approached the car and took out a box of short mag rounds before placing it on the hood. He removed the clip from his rifle and replaced the 2 shots. He fired quickly before strangely hesitating to reload the clip. Instead, he turned to face me and extended the clip. "Out here, son, that'll give you an extra one," he said firmly as I looked at him strangely. "Dad. So, how about you?" He turned back toward the car and reached in again as I lifted my hand to take the full clip from him. He quickly pulled out his old 30-30 rifle. Without giving it a second thought, he started loading it with ammo from an old and battered 30-30 bucks he'd brought with him. I shook my head and approached him. "No, Dad, that gun is old, and if we come across that thing, we'll need power. We have a short magnum." "Dad, the 3030 is my gun," he said quickly, "and it's currently reliable. I've had this gun for 30 years, and it still shoots like new." "I know, and there will be plenty." "You also have the short mag?" He turned and put his hand on my shoulder after loading the rounds, saying, "We can take care of it now. Are you prepared?" I turned my gaze away from him, and toward the woods, which had not previously appeared dark or ominous even in daylight. The trees seemed to suck up the light like a vampire, casting shadows where a sickening, patchy-furred monster could creep up on us and tear us apart. "We're on the hunt for John?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the forest, trying to see through the darkness and hoping not to see too many bloodshot eyes staring back at me. "We're going to get him back," I said, taking a deep breath and nodding before slipping the extra clip into my pocket. My hands moved to unspool the rifle from my shoulder, and I returned my gaze to my father. "Okay," I spoke, my voice much quieter than it should have been. "Let's get started." Our search began in the late afternoon, when the sun seemed to be losing its battle to stay high in the sky, and returning to the woods while that thing was still out there terrified me to death. I'd already seen it rip that deer apart, and now John was missing as well. I secretly hoped he got lost on the way back and we'd come across him trying to find his way back to the path. I hated to admit it, but I was hoping he was just lost, because the alternative was that monster. I pushed those thoughts away and gripped my rifle tightly. My gaze drifted over to my father as we moved. He stepped swiftly and carefully, eyes darting around him. Every now and then, he would stop and we would just listen before continuing. I was relieved he had had that hunting experience. It would be extremely beneficial right now. He was still nervous, I could tell. His hands were gripping his trusty gun too tightly and shaking slightly. I had the same fear as you, Dad. The sky darkened and became still. Thankfully, all I heard and saw were bugs and small animals scurrying around, no creature yet, but that didn't mean it wasn't still out there watching and waiting. My father abruptly came to a halt, and knelt near a large tree. I followed him carefully and quietly as he reached down and picked up what appeared to be the mangled remains of a DSLR camera, the body smashed in and the lens broken off. Worst of all, I could see smears of blood from the camera and the neck hanger. I couldn't take it any longer. I turned and retched, collapsing as the remains of bacon and eggs in my stomach spilled all over the forest floor. My father said nothing and just looked down inside. As I knelt on the ground, trying to recover, we both knew. I saw my father get to his feet and walk through the trees. I took a few deep breaths before pulling myself up and sprinting after him. He walked for a short distance every now and then, glancing down at the ground and then back up. I didn't even dare to look. I knew what he was looking for. I just couldn't bring myself to believe it. It didn't take long for the smell to hit me. He was sent by that coppery. Fresh blood pricked my nostrils, and I held my breath. No, this was not it. We're going to look for a deer. A bear. Anything but this, not this, not this. I tried to remain calm. I simply lied to myself. We quickly located John. My father followed the blood smears I refused to look at until he came across a large one splattered against a large tree. He sagged in the dangling branches as drops of blood mixed with wood and dirt at the base of the tree. I only had a split second to look before I had to turn away, but it was just long enough to see the gouge marks running along his arm, which hung limply over the branch swaying in the light breeze, and the bits of flesh and intestine that threatened to spill out with the slightest movement. My father frowned and curled his lip. I could see moisture forming in his eyes as he just stared up. I could tell what was going through his mind when he looked from the tree to me. Is John dead? My uncle and his brother-in-law are both deceased. And the two of us were still trapped here with the murderer. I was in jeopardy. I could see what he was seeing in his mind. Dad noticed me dangling in that tree, blood dripping down a lifeless body. He quickly turned away and reached for my shoulder. He said quickly and quietly, "We're leaving." It took me a few moments to fully comprehend. He was already dragging me through the trees back to the camp. In a daze from the recent events, I moved along lifelessly. It was becoming too much. One of us was already dead, and we might be joining him soon. I fought back tears and accelerated my pace. I desired to leave. I just wanted to get home and away from this sickening thing. Darkness quickly descended, and I had no idea how long we had been searching or how quickly night had descended on the area. As night fell, our pace quickened. We almost felt like we were running back to camp. This afternoon, my thoughts returned to the past. I nearly choked as the image of that creature screeching and barreling after us flashed through my mind. I could almost hear it running alongside us through the trees, ready to pounce and rip us apart. When my father and I returned to the camp clearing, I breathed a sigh of relief. He made no hesitations. He moved for the car after one last look around for Jonathan. "What about our belongings?" I asked, coming up behind him and motioning to our gear. We still had our tent, cooking supplies, food, and everything else we had brought lying around. Dad said as he flung open the car door, "We don't need it. That screech has been replaced by everything else. We don't require it." As he flung open the car door, Dad said, "That screech cut him off from the side of the car has all been replaced." I noticed it. It erupted and reared up. I only saw it up close for a split second, but it felt longer. I appear to have enough time to take in every detail. Its brownish-black fur appeared to be in patches due to areas of its black skin that appeared diseased and rotted. It was tall and scrawny, overly scrawny, with bones that protruded in such a way that they seemed ready to tear through the skin at any moment. It had a canine-like muzzle and jaws that opened to reveal thick, yellowed fangs. It stood on thin back legs that led to elongated three-toed feet with three long claws that dug into the earth beneath it. A three-clawed hand rose and smacked my father in the chin, throwing him back into the ground. The .30-30 rifle slipped from his grasp and landed a few feet away in the soft dirt. The creature then turned to face me, his blood-red eyes locked on mine. When I returned its stare, my mouth hung open in surprise as it snarled at me, sickly black drool oozing from its jaws. At the very least, I remembered my rifle and raised it to point the barrel at it. The creature's arm shot out, hand grasping around the barrel, and I didn't think that scrawny form could have wrenched it out of my grasp and tossed it away from me with such strength. I took a step back and was about to turn around and flee. I felt a heavy form crash over me when it leapt, sending my back down into hard dirt. As it tackled and restrained me, the stench of rotting flesh and dried blood assaulted my nostrils. I'm going to die now, God, I'm going to die. That's all I can come up with. I noticed it raise a clawed hand. The sound of something hard smacking into flesh echoed loudly, and the creature stumbled off me. When I turned and crawled away, panting heavily, I saw my father standing there, both hands clutched together in front of him, after apparently sending a hard haymaker into the back of the creature. Hell. I had no idea he still had that much strength in him. The monster had already recovered and resurfaced, hissing and screeching at my father. My breath caught in my throat as my father looked at me. He wasn't doing anything to help. He just wanted to divert attention away from me. My father was willing to die in order to save me. The creature rose and attacked those closet fathers. As my father fell backward to the ground, it struck him in the arms, leaving those gashes, and I needed to move. I had to get up. I needed to get away. He was going to give his life for me, and all I could do was sit and watch. I pushed myself up with my arms, my gaze fixed on the scene before me. My hand brushed against something metal. When I looked down, I saw my father's 30 lying next to me. The creature then took a step forward and collapsed. My father stood over him, pinning him to the ground. I yanked the gun from my hands and read it. Never shoot your gun if you could help a son find something to balance it on. Unless absolutely necessary, just hold it. When I heard those words, I adjusted my position, sitting down and raising my knees to rest the gun on them, just like my father had done when he shot that deer. My father yelled something at me, and I thought it said run, but I couldn't hear it over the hissing of the creature. Relax, close one eye, and stay focused on your target. I rolled my shoulders, forcing my muscles to relax and close one eye, allowing the sight to focus in on the monster's drooling head. As my father closed his eyes and turned away, the monster opened its mouth and screeched in his face, drool oozing out and over him. Now, when you're ready, hold your breath for a few seconds, but not too long, or you'll start shaking just enough. I took a deep breath in and held it, the gun steadying in my hands as my breathing came to a halt. The creature's arm rose, claws lifted and ready to flay into my father for the time being. This was the end. I'd only have one shot, and if I failed, my father would perish. Then, like milking a cow, slowly squeeze the trigger down. My finger slowly pressed the trigger as I tried to imagine what a milking account must be like. The clawed hand of the creature fell downward. The shot rang out, and I heard a sick crunching noise mixed with splatter. The beast howled and lurched away from my father. It has oversized hands that grip its head and are in pain. I thought I saw blood pouring out of the side of its deformed skull. It jerked around, stumbling on its feet, before snarling at me. Then it turned around and ran back into the woods. I sat there panting in silence. My eyes returned to my father as sweat poured down my face. He lay there, not moving quickly. I stood up and slid down beside him. "Dad!" I screamed. "Come on, Dad." He blinked and looked up at me before rising and wrapping his arms around me in a tight hug. I returned his hug and closed my eyes. We were fine. We were both fine. My father soon let go and pushed himself to his feet. He returned his gaze to the wood as a hand rose to wipe some of the foul-smelling drool from his face. He started with a slight stammer before leaving a hand on my shoulder. He said, "I taught you well," and I couldn't help but chuckle. We didn't squander any time. We got into that car and drove away. We didn't say anything until the car pulled out of the winding, bumpy road and onto the main highway. I was the first to break the silence nearly an hour later. "What do you believe it was?" As I turned to face him, I asked quietly. "I'm not sure." I was the only response I received. What are we going to say about John? A wild animal attacked him. We recorded it. But we believe it escaped. He sighed and lowered his head. I knew he felt responsible for John, but it wasn't even his fault, it was all the damn thing's fault. Nobody would believe us if we said a monster turned him into such an animal. It simply had to be an animal. We remained silent for a few moments longer before I spoke quietly and nervously. "What if that thing reappears?" I inquired, my gaze fixed on my father. "What if it tracks you down and comes after us again?" That's when my father did something unexpected. He smirked. He smirked and shook his head. "I'm not scared if it does." That surprised me and I gave him an odd look like he had finally gone crazy. "Dad, that thing took a bullet to the face and you're not scared of it, son." He began as he glanced at me, a confident look on his face. "You shot that thing in the head and it howled and ran away. That means it was hurt, means it was scared of getting hurt more, and if it's scared of getting hurt more," and that grin on his face grew wider. "Well, that means we could kill it."